Shopping is hard.
I can never find anything in my size.
I don't even know my size.
I buy my clothes the same place I buy my groceries.
There's a better way. Make it easy with Stitch Fix. Just share your size, style, budget, and done. Your personal stylist sends pieces picked just for you.
That was easy.
Stitch Fix. Online personal styling for everyone. Free shipping and returns. No subscription required. Get started today at stitchfix.com.
My favorite thing about Shipt since I signed up for Target Circle 360? No price markups when I order same-day delivery from tons of local stores. Only a handful of alcohol retailers and items don't count. I won't lie, I've had too much fun being like, markups on groceries? Not in my fridge. Markups on pet food? Not for my DOG. Markups on tools, electronics, home goods, meds? Not in my house. Anyway, it's awesome. Order now at shipt.com/360. Terms apply.
Home means something different to everyone. But with Rocket Mortgage, home can mean even more. It can mean a college education, taming your high-interest debt, even a renovation. We've made it easier than ever to use your home equity. That home you worked so hard for, now it can work hard for you. Call 800-4ROCKET or visit rocket.com to find out more.
Rocket Mortgage, LLC, licensed in all 50 states, and MLSconsumeraccess.org, number 3030.
The events of April 18th and 19th, 2020 shocked the country. Those were the 2 days when Gabriel Wortman, a denturist from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, killed 22 people in a massacre in what officials eventually dubbed the Nova Scotia mass casualty event. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. I'm Brian Lilly, your host, and today we're going to look at what happened on those days and the days that followed, but from a different angle. There has been an official police investigation. There has been a commission of inquiry. But do we know the real story? Paul Palango says no. Palango is a veteran journalist who worked for the Hamilton Spectator, was a top editor at the Globe and Mail, worked on CTV's W5. He left daily journalism years ago for a new life in Nova Scotia. And then this event happened, and Palango realized we weren't being told the truth, not through the official story. He's one of the writers that I've relied on and corresponded with since those days when I've been writing about these issues over the past 5 years. In 2022, he published the book 22 Murders. This past week, a new book was published by Random House called Anatomy of a Cover-Up, The Truth About the RCMP and the Nova Scotia Massacres. One of his big theories, Gabriel Wortman, was an insider, an agent for the RCMP. Here's my conversation with Paul Palango. Paul, what was it about the whole situation surrounding Gabriel Wortman, the RCMP, the mass casualty event, as they bizarrely and euphemistically call it, that made you say something isn't right here? Because you were the first journalist that I was reading at the time saying something's not right here.
Well, Brian, it struck me on day one when my wife alerted to me what was going on that Sunday, April 19th, 2020, that something wasn't right. There was a man dressed up as a Mountie going around killing people. No one was stopping him, and he seemed to be everywhere in the province. The police never got in front of him. The way they handled everything, they said Gabriel Wortman is in custody. Then 3 hours later reported, well, actually, he was shot dead. I said, none of this is unfolded as I could see the way a normal police response would go. And that told me, based on my experience, I was told a long time ago by a bunch of senior cops, when you see something strange going on that's absolutely inexplicable, think blown undercover operation. The police were doing something and it got out of hand. And I thought, this sort of looks like, I'm going to go work on that theory. And that was always in the back of my mind. And then I tried to help mainstream journalists with what I knew and what I suspected was going on. And they all said, well, go away, old man. We don't know who you are. We can do this ourselves. And I knew that within about 2 or 3 weeks, they'd be off covering flower shows and the real story wouldn't be covered. And I'll just stick to it and not cover it.
You were uncovering things, writing for Frank magazine, and I know it's a different one in Nova Scotia than the one in Ottawa, but you don't think of Frank Magazine as the place for breaking, hard-hitting news. It's a different type of publication, and you were putting out more information, serious information, than anybody else. Now, your first book on what happened on that horrible weekend in April 2020 was about the actual killings. And at the end of it, you posit that this idea that you were talking about that said Wortman was an undercover agent. Did that ever come up at the commission? Did anyone talk about that? Was it reported, uncovered, discussed?
What they did was they sort of raised it and dismissed it and said we could find no evidence that Gabriel Wortman was an undercover confidential informant or agent for the RCMP in Nova Scotia. And that's the thing, in Nova Scotia. I had always posited that Wortman, if anything, was working for the RCMP in New Brunswick, next door. May well have been working in Nova Scotia as well, but they did this little sidestep. And then in the evidence...
It's always important to look at language. Like, you know, it's not something I remember them teaching me in journalism school, but it's something you learn working as a journalist. When the language is precise like that, it leads to more questions, right? In Nova Scotia.
Absolutely. And most journalists, almost all the journalists covering this, don't understand the distinctions, don't understand how the RCMP operates, don't understand or appreciate the history of the RCMP. You know, in one of my books, Dispersing the Fog in 2008, I have a whole chapter and much more in the book that the chapter is described shades of truth, that the RCMP speaks in shades of truth. And that one of its sort of internal sort of mottos among members is lie until you die. And I know that. And so I don't trust what they say because I know they lie. I know they speak in shades of truth, and I'm there to dissect it. And then the last point on this, Brian, you get back to the Mass Casualty Commission. What I show in the book is all these things that people talking about Wortman, documents I find that suggest he's a confidential informant and had a relationship with the police that I found in the millions of pages. If he wasn't, it's sort of the negative proof. If he wasn't an RCMP confidential informant or agent, none of this should have been in the record. None whatsoever. But there are indications there that he was.
Before we dive into the book, what is it about the RCMP that fascinates you? Because you seem to love the organization, and yet you're highly critical of it at the same time, which I can understand. But what is it that drives your desire to say, fix this broken thing?
I got involved in this back in 1993 when I was 1992 when I was doing I was working briefly for W5, and I did an interview with an former assistant commissioner, Rod Stamler, who had a connection to where we come from, Hamilton. So Rod Stamler was the investigator for the RCMP during the dredging scandal and the Hamilton Harbor affair, which broke in my first week when I worked at the Hamilton Spectator. And I always followed what the federal police were doing in the 70s. And when I sat down with Stamler to do the pre-interview, when it was all over, I said, I have a question for you. And he goes, what's that? And I said, the RCMP was a serious federal police force and successful in the 60s and 70s, but was failing in the 80s and 90s. Why? And Stamler basically took off his glasses and said to me, that is a very good question. And now I'm like going on my 6th book answering that question, because federal policing is very important, and it's not being done in Canada. That's
as we've discussed on past episodes of Full Comment, I mean, this is a police force that is neither fish nor fowl. It really should be broken up into local policing or divested from local policing and have a real federal police force. Instead, it's handing out traffic tickets in rural Nova Scotia or on the highways of Alberta, and at the same time trying to investigate serious federal matters that it doesn't appear to be equipped for.
No, it doesn't. In fact, one of the things you should look at when you don't have federal, what you do at the federal level, when you have federal police not doing their job, that's what, I've had policing experts tell me that if you look at all the problems with drug problems in small towns in Canada, fraud, cyber fraud, all those things going on, some of these social issues, is the result of the lack of federal policing in Canada. And then so the RCMP concentrates itself on selling itself as a contract police force to provinces and municipalities outside of Ontario and Quebec. They're short-staffed. They're not trained properly. They're not trained to the level of the municipal police. And finally, they're not accountable. And what we see in the Mass Casualty Commission and what happened in Nova Scotia is the RCMP is an unaccountable police force that is oddly protected by the federal government, who will do anything to save the force, because it appears that federal politicians like the force the way it is. Ineffective, just a symbol rather than an actual police force, effective police force.
Well, and we saw the degree to which the RCMP will help with cover-ups when it came to Brenda Lucki and trying to help the Trudeau government with information they needed for their bogus decision to ban firearms based on this event. I mean, that was incredibly political on her end and Bill Blair's and all of that.
But you have to look at that. It's interesting you picked on that one incident. People miss the point of what that really was about. It's partly about the guns, but at the time that was going on, Andrew Douglas from Frank Magazine made the decision that the RCMP and the Mass Casualty Commission were covering up how Wortman was shot. Gabriel Wortman, the mass killer, was shot. Mm-hmm. The RCMP had concocted a story that the Mass Casualty Commission and the police watchdog, went along with, that became sort of the official narrative, that two Mounties stumbled upon him while they're getting gas, got out of their car, saw a bruise on his head, identified him, recognized he had Heidi Stevenson's gun, eventually shot him in a gunfight. That's their story. That's not what happened. Part of that happened at another gas station that they covered up and didn't discuss. In the actual shooting at Enfield, we fought to get all the videotapes out, which showed that from the time the policeman pulled up, Constable Hubley pulled up, to the time to getting out of his car and firing the first shot. Just imagine this: the car tilts to a stop. From that moment, 5.5 seconds to the first shot is fired. They knew it was Wortman. They denied they knew that. And we wanted to show that. So those tapes were coming out. And as the tapes came out, Brenda Lucki story breaks. All the media attention gets diverted away. Brenda Lucki was toast anyway. She was at the end of her term.
Yeah.
And so they made this big kerfuffle to deflect attention away from the Mounties had executed Wortman and did nothing to try to arrest him.
There's so many stories, and you document them, and I encourage people to read the book, but you, even the idea of him escaping and how he allegedly escaped, was it a blueberry field, and he snuck away. You document that he drove right past the Mounties.
Well, it's even more distressing than that. They made this story up that, see, one of the problems of the entire Nova Scotia massacres is the RCMP constantly speculates and builds a narrative that the media gobbles up, and most of that narrative is not true. In fact, one of my citizen investigators, Ryan Potter, put it the other day. He says, imagine that there's a train trip that sort of begins before the massacres, during the massacres, and after, and it's a train ride, and there's stations along the way. He says every station, the story is screwed up, manipulated, and tweaked to fit the official narrative. And one of the first things was the way Wortman escaped. He went down a road through a road in a blueberry field that no one knew about. and got around the police and got away, and then lived to tell another day, then killed 9 more people the next day. I show with multiple pieces of evidence, not only that how they covered it up, manipulated a map, made evidence disappear, ignored evidence that was before them to make the case that Wortman went through the Blueberry Field Road. In fact, he drove right past the Mounties. But the real story there is that the story was concocted before all the evidence was in. And the media took that evidence, made it gospel, and the real story was they said he escaped at 10:45. But what happened was, once that got out, a fellow stepped forward named Dean Dillman and said, well, I want to tell you that I was there at the road, and I don't want to get caught up in the investigation. He was trying to be helpful. But Dillman's testimony eventually shows it was impossible for Wortman to have gone that way. It was totally ignored. Why is that important? Because one of the victims, Corey Ellison, who was visiting his father, walked up the road when he saw the fires in Portapic and ended up being murdered. The RCMP discovered that, left that body outside on the road for probably 12 to 14 hours. They discovered it 3 times during the night. And only after they put their narrative out did they discover that Corey Ellison was killed at 12 p.m. that night. That made it impossible for him to go up the Blueberry Field Road because Dean Dillman was already there. But secondly, it seems in my mind, based on the evidence, to eliminate Wortman as the shooter, because it didn't make sense for him to be there, because that's where the first 3 911 calls come from, right in that area. The RCMP said
So if he had gone up the Blueberry Road, he couldn't have shot Corey Ellison.
No, he couldn't get to the Blueberry Field Road because there's a number of obstacles that I described.
Yeah.
It didn't happen. But the MCC, so what this shows, the Blueberry Field story shows how the federal government, Department of Justice, the Mass Casualty Commission, and the RCMP all sort of colluded to massage the story, because what they're protecting is the likelihood that a Mountie accidentally shot Corey Ellison. So that's one thing that's going on. And then the evidence for that, Brian, there's 3 things. One, in the first press conference, this horrible debacle of a press conference, in a response to a question, Chief Superintendent Chris Leather said, we're making 3 references to the police watchdog CERT about shootings. One was the shooting of Wortman. One is the crazy shoot-up of the Onslow Belmont Fire Hall by 2 Mounties who were pursuing Wortman. And the third, he said, is, quote, an exchange of gunfire between the gunman and the RCMP the previous night. That eventually disappears. That complaint is never made, and there was never an exchange between the RCMP and Wortman that night. So what really happened? And secondly, second piece of evidence, there's an obscure thing in one of the original statements by Lisa Banfield, Wortman's girlfriend, who was hiding in the woods, apparently, who said, I heard someone say, how's it going, boys? And then bang, 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 bang. And then that is not explored, or that disappears. And there's other stuff. There's lots of evidence.
So 2 questions come to mind as we're talking. On the one hand, in the early days or early hours, having covered a number of these breaking news events, the shooter on Parliament Hill, and on, you get a lot of misinformation. As a reporter, you get a lot of misinformation, and I've often been doing broadcast news when that's happening, radio or television. And so you always have to warn people, look, we're bringing you the best information that we have at the moment, but this can change. And so I remember when the attack on Parliament Hill happened, Corporal Nathan Cirillo was shot. There were reports of the police looking for multiple gunmen. Well, it was only one guy, and he was dead, shot by Kevin Vickers in the Hall of Honor in center block. So I can understand the media making mistakes, but part of your contention is they didn't correct them, and they weren't curious.
Well, time and time again, when I broke stories, I broke stories early on because one of the things I had to do to make them produce documents was demonstrate I could penetrate the walls of the RCMP, the Department of Justice, the government, the Mass Casualty Commission, CERT, and get information and publish it. We'd publish things like the RCMP had a moratorium on the destruction of evidence in the Gabriel Wortman case. 3 months into the investigation, they were destroying evidence. And the media didn't respond. And you know why they didn't respond like they didn't do in any of the other things we broke? Well, that's not what the RCMP is saying. I had this famous call from, I reported 22 murders, that when I started to sort of explore the notion that Wortman was a confidential informant, the CBC reporter went to Darren Campbell of the RCMP, who said, "Oh, that's Palango just writing another fairy tale." And the CBC reported, "Oh, here's another fairy tale from Paul Palango." And I said, "No, this is based on my knowledge, my sources, that there's something going on here." But they will not, the reporters and their editors will not deviate from the official narrative of the story. If someone in the power is not saying it, it's not news.
So people could just sit here and say, well, who's Paul Palango? What does he know? This is just a crazy old man in Nova Scotia writing stuff that isn't true. But this is a book published by Random House. You have obviously documented it well enough that one of the major publishers in Canada, in the world, really, in the English-speaking world, has said, yes, there's enough here to warrant putting out a book, and we will stand behind it, because if you're publishing false information, they're liable for the consequences.
Thoroughly vetted. It's all based. The thing is, it's not speculation. And the other thing, Brian, is I wrote 2 books about this. I wrote one book to set up the story. The last line in the first book is, "What's the big secret?" The second, which was forcing the Mass Casualty Commission to address all the things I raised, that I knew they would hide the documents. And then they tried to hide the documents, and me and a group of citizen investigators uncovered them all as much as we could. A lot of smoking guns in there, and published the second book. Now, the second book is based on documents. It's not me. It's not me sitting in my armchair saying, this is what the police should do. This is what the documents say happened, and they hid a lot of these documents, or massaged them in such a way that people didn't recognize what they were really saying.
Tell me what you learned about the Keystone Cop incident of the 2 Mounties shooting at each other, thinking they had Wortman at the fire hall. Utterly bizarre that this could happen in what's supposed to be a very professional federal police force.
Well, at this point, it's not a federal police force there. They're operating under the laws of Nova Scotia as a provincial or municipal police force. What was going on there, and never really understood by the mass media, was that an incident earlier at the Fisher House in Glenholm, where Wortman apparently knocked on their door, and they called the Mounties. The Mounties, as the Mounties approached there, an order was given that they had compromised authority. Compromised authority meant if they saw him, they could shoot him without getting approval from anyone. So the cops went from that scene down to Debert, where 2 VON nurses were shot. Horrible situation. There was the story in itself in the book. And then the next stop was the Oslo Belmont Fire Hall. They were chasing Wortman, trying to find him, didn't know where he was. But they were not putting up roadblocks in front of him to stop him because they're afraid to have a confrontation. So he drove for almost 200 kilometers. Nobody got in front of him. but they were following behind. And I think that the Onslow Belmont Fire Hall.
And was he in the cruiser at this point?
Yeah, at this point, he was in the cruiser. There's a Mountie sitting in the Onslow Belmont Fire Hall protecting some of the victims from Portapique who are being kept there. Wortman drives by. It's shown on the camera. I believe that Wortman, and this is never disclosed, but this is one of the 6 incidents I point out where I believe Wortman used a phone or a radio connected to the RCMP system and said, he's at the fire hall. The 2 Mounties show up, and in their version of the story, which is accepted by CERT and by the MCC, we showed up, we saw him standing out there. It wasn't him. It was an emergency measures organization guy named David Westlake. We gave him orders. He didn't comply, and we shot. And they ended up missing everyone, bullets going through the wall, narrowly missing people inside. Then they went in, saw nobody was right, got in the car and drove off, and didn't report it until the 911 call came in from the fire hall. That, that was us. But when the Mass Casualty Commission addressed this is how they addressed it. They brought out into the public forum the people who were inside the fire hall, not any of the multitude of witnesses on the outside who saw what happened. And what happened was the Mounties in an unmarked Nissan Altima pulled up and stopped short of the fire hall, where they couldn't possibly have known or seen him and made an estimation. They're
shooting from far away.
Well, they started shooting from far away, so far away that they put a bullet through the neon sign or the electronic sign on the western edge of the property where there's a giant hedge. So they were far away trying to sneak up on them. So that tells me they had advanced knowledge. But the MCC said, we don't want to interview. They exposed none of the witnesses on the outside who saw this, including one guy who was right in the middle of it, a guy named Jerome Bro, who I wrote about in Frank magazine. And in fact, the CERT, the police watchdog, said, well, he couldn't hear what was really being said because his car engine was on. He had an electric car. They did. That's how far they went to cover up that story.
All right, we need to take a quick break, Paul. When we come back, I do want to ask you more questions about the just ridiculous way the RCMP investigated this, but the ongoing cover-up that you detail. More in moments.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Hi, this is Joe from Vanta. In today's digital world, compliance regulations are changing constantly, and earning customer trust has never mattered more. Vanta helps companies get compliant fast and stay secure with the most advanced AI, automation, and continuous monitoring out there. So whether you're a startup going for your first SOC 2 or ISO 27001, or a growing enterprise managing vendor risk, Vanta makes it quick, easy, and scalable. And I'm not just saying that because I work here. Get started at Vanta.com.
Are you a forward thinker? Then you need an HR and finance platform that thinks like you do. Workday is the AI platform that helps propel your organization, your workforce, and your industry into the future. Workday, moving business forever forward.
This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew and tell you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
So, Paul, when this was still a breaking news story, it was Frank magazine out of Halifax that published a story. It wasn't your story, as you corrected me. It was someone else, but they had tracked down Gabriel Wortman's father, who told them that, yeah, this guy had illegal guns. Yeah, we'd reported him for violence before. RCMP never did anything. And perhaps that, points to your theory that Wortman was a a police informant. That's why they were allowing things to go on, even as people were reporting on them. How did you end up at Frank, and how did Frank become the place that was publishing this material that, fairly explosive?
Well, I started doing stuff for Maclean's because I got hooked up with Stephen Marr, who asked me some questions, and I gave him some. I told him this is what I would do, and then next, I found Wortman's money that he got $475,000 from Brinks, and I used talk radio as a medium to get the story out. The Halifax newspapers wouldn't cover the story properly. It wouldn't go near me because I was too controversial. The CBC and all the TV stations, they don't know how to do this. I went to after Maclean's got itchy and said, well, there was some pushback from the government about the confidential informant theory, and they got all jittery about it. And so then I went and did a couple of stories in the National Post. And then I wanted to do a story on Lisa Banfield. And Frank Magazine was the only one who named Lisa Banfield. And Andrew Douglas did a clever job. He says,
and Lisa Banfield being the
Wortman's girlfriend,
his abused girlfriend,
his abused girlfriend. Yeah. Yes. And Andrew cleverly did a cover photo of her and says, the hero of Portapic. He says, who's going to complain about that? And so he got her name up. But nobody, 6-7 months after the massacres, she was still unnamed. Wortman was unnamed because all the newspapers taking their cue from Prime Minister Trudeau, who said, we should not glorify this infamy and not name him.
I don't agree with that. There's a lot of media that do that now after any sort of mass shooting or mass killing. I don't know what purpose it serves. I know that the theory is that these guys crave fame. Well, most of the time they're dead, and we need to know who we're talking about.
Yeah, because other people know them, and it sort of awakens things in them, and more information may come forward. And so
7-8 months go by, and they haven't named.
They haven't named her, and they haven't named him. They said the girlfriend, the perpetrator. They called him GW and things like that. And the poor innocent person who escaped from handcuffs and did all this stuff and then hid outside all night on a night where it was snowing in Halifax with no shoes, no socks, a pair of yoga pants on and a spandex top. I didn't believe her story. My expert was nature. It's like the story doesn't make sense. And so I wanted to write. I was gathering more and more information about Lisa Banfield. I wanted to write about her. But I finally got, I tried one outlet, I tried another outlet. I got a note back saying, oh, well, the editor thinks, the women's groups will be really upset about this. And this is a national newspaper. And I go, it's the truth. These are reasonable questions. And if they're going to march, as one reporter says, if you write that story, reporters are going to march on your store, because we had a business in Chester, Nova Scotia. And I says, march. I don't care. I'm telling the truth. These are reasonable questions. I don't believe her story. I need more evidence. She's never given an interview. And so when no one would run it, I phoned Andrew up and I says, okay, here's the deal. I'll do these stories, but I can't write like Frank. I just write my stories the way I want to write them. And he goes, sold. And so we were getting ready to do our first story. And it was public knowledge this was going to happen on a Monday. And what happened on Friday? The RCMP charged Lisa Banfield with and her brother and brother-in-law with providing ammunition to Wortman. That's the way they deflect news. And I remember at the time I had journalists come to me and say, well, what do you think this means? And I said, they're bullshit charges. They're like a traffic ticket, but they're going to use this to hide behind that Lisa Banfield does not have to do interviews, and we can't do anything to her because she's now being charged. And she goes to the Mass Casualty Commission and finally testifies on July 15th, 2022. And right afterwards, two things happen. One, the charges against her are dismissed. or in a restorative justice process, which I have no idea how that worked. And two, then they released all the financial records about Lisa Banfield, which show her story was all bullshit.
And it's the financial records that you say prove not a victim.
Not
Why?
a victim. Well, the official narrative was that she made $15,000 a year, was a work slave and a sex slave of Wortman. Well, I show that they likely had a polyamorous relationship. They had relationship with other people. Wortman had multitude of relationships. But in the 19 months prior to the massacres, according to the records which were released, and none of the information published about her by any of the media, even though it was there, showing that she was spending on her credit cards alone, not her debit, no cash. She was spending about $5,200 a month average for 19 months, $160,000. And the bills were paid for. She was driving a Mercedes that she paid for. The whole story was she didn't even really live with Wortman. They lived sort of separately and visited each other occasionally. And they seem to be, if you go by the emails and all the evidence, they seem to be sort of together right to the end. And even the so-called domestic violence case, I take apart in the book and show how sort of flimsy that sort of allegation is.
One of the weapons that Wortman used, of course, he had several illegal firearms smuggled in from the United States, but in the end, he was using a RCMP issued pistol belonging to Constable Heidi Stevenson. How did he get that, and how does the real story differ from the official story?
The official story is Heidi Stevenson and Wortman looking like two police cars crashed together at a traffic circle in Shubenacadie. And then there's the epic fire afterwards. And Heidi Stevenson is left dead in this, as well as an innocent bystander who went to help named Joey Weber. The official story is very vague. And then a couple of days later, Brian Sauvé from the National Police Federation, the police union, says, Heidi Stevenson was a hero. She rammed Wortman and took him off the playing field and saved lives and lost her life. She's a hero. A couple of days later, the RCMP comes out and says, no, that didn't happen. She did not ram him. Wortman rammed her. But she was involved in a gun battle with Wortman, and she fired shots at him. But there's no real detail on that till about 2 years later during the Mass Casualty Commission, where this fantastic story comes out that Heidi Stevenson fired 14 shots at Wortman, winged him in the head, and 12 of those shots were outside the car and 2 were inside the car. And so right away, everyone's weeping. There's heroes. Monuments are going to be put up that Heidi Stevenson was a hero. And I always had problems with the Heidi Stevenson story. I mean, the one and only interview I did on the CBC radio 3 days after the event was the host asked me, and what about Heidi Stevenson? She's a hero. And I said, my question is very simple. Why was she there? He said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, 19 people were already dead and she was alone in a car. And why was she alone? Like, I don't understand that. And then as I got into the case and started investigating for the book, I eventually concluded that there were 27 witnesses to what happened at Shubenacadie. No one who was close to the scene saw Heidi Stevenson get out of her car. She was likely disabled by the airbag in her car. 12 bullet casings are outside the car and 2 are inside the car. They're found days later. The 2 bullets inside the car are problematic. How did she fire those bullets? Where did she fire them? Because where was to her right or behind her or to her back left? there are no holes in the windows, because I have photos of the car before the fire showing there's no holes in the windows. In fact, in the MCC report, in the direction Wortman was coming from, there was one bullet hole going down through the front passenger door. That was likely Wortman shooting at her and finishing her off a through-and-through shot. So I started to wonder, like, I concluded as I was writing that chapter that they faked this story. This is a fake story, that she was executed. All the witnesses I talked to said she never got out of the car. So she was executed. But I'm just going to say this and go down the line. I think this is what happened. And as I was doing the final proof, just sort of dotting I's and crossing T and going through the documents again, I found a section where there are 77 documents. 55 of them were pictures of a pair of charred handcuffs that were found near the memorial site for Heidi Stevenson days after the event, which is very curious. And they tried to link these to the so-called handcuffs that Lisa Banfield was supposedly locked up in. And that's a problematic story, because the original story is Lisa Banfield escaped the handcuffs, and later it became, well, it was only on one wrist. And then at the MCC, she said, I sort of scarred my wrist taking off the handcuffs. Well, if it was only on one wrist, why did she take them off? She could run, so why did she take them off? Doesn't make sense. Anyway, I'm going through there and I see another document. I said, what is that? And I look at it, and it's a letter from the police watchdog, from Patrick Curran, Patrick Curran, former Chief Justice of the Nova Scotia Provincial and Family Court, who was sitting in as interim chief of CERT. And it was 3 days after after Stevenson was killed. The RCMP had asked him to investigate the possibility that in the gunfight they believed happened, Heidi Stevenson accidentally shot Joey Weber, and therefore that was a police-involved shooting. And Curran looked at it and said, hit the road, basically. I put most of the letter in the book, showing this institution-to-institution missive that was like basically telling the RCMP, you're fabricating this. He says, you already told me on Sunday in your initial investigation she was executed. Now you're coming back 2 days later and say, no, she was in a gunfight and killed an innocent bystander. No innocent bystander saw this. Nobody ducked a bullet. There were no holes anywhere. And it raises questions. Okay, they fabricated the story to create a hero. Poor Heidi Stevenson was, as I show, was not trained very well, could not carry, like 3 of the female members who were involved in this on the ground, failed all their carbine testing, so they could not be in any sort of tactical situation. She was not the person to be there. She had no direction. She didn't know how dangerous it was. She was killed, so they thought, we'll make a hero of her. And I'm sorry, but they made the story up. But the question is, Brian, where did the shell casings come from? If they planted shell casings on the scene to make the hero story, what else did they do? And there's plenty of that, as I show in the book.
Well, I think in documenting the story the way you have in the book, you show that the idea is a lack of proper leadership and coordination by RCMP brass in this investigation, because this is day 2, and as you just said, she was there with no direction. Well, how do you have people going around with no direction on day 2?
Because what they clearly were doing, the RCMP in Nova Scotia is divided into, say, county patrols. Portapique and what happened to the north were in different counties. They were trying to control this and keep it in the county and keep it in their own jurisdiction, which is a sign that Wortman was a confidential informant. They wanted this to stay contained. They didn't tell Truro police what was going on until after Wortman had passed through Truro. They didn't ask for their engagement because they wanted no other force investigating, creating files that would force them to open up their files. And I had this from the inside, and I talk about this. So the whole movement was not to alert anyone, not even their own members in other counties, how dangerous the situation was. And as I point out in the book, one of the people who was working with Stevenson had to call someone else in like New Brunswick. What's going on in the neighboring county? Because the RCMP was not telling them, because they didn't want the story to get out. They were hoping that they could chase Wortman down, kill him before he got out of Colchester County. He got out, and that's how Stevenson got killed.
So why do you suspect New Brunswick, that he was working with the RCMP there? I mean, I imagine it would be across the maritime provinces, but why New Brunswick if he's based in Portapique?
Well, he's from New Brunswick. He was active all his life. His early criminal activities were involved in Fredericton and the border and smuggling guns, grenades. None of this comes up to the MCC. They don't get into Wortman's criminal background because that would force them to open files, the RCMP to open files. And in the previous years, the assistant commissioner in New Brunswick, Larry Tremblay, took over all anti-biker operations in the Maritimes. And there was a particular focus on the Hells Angels and their puppet clubs. And in the months leading up to what was the massacres, a series of arrests were happening in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. The last one being on April 10th, when 2 Hells Angels and 2 Red Devils were arrested in New Brunswick. And the culmination of a case against the top Hells Angels guys in that province. And I was led to believe by my sources that Wortman was actually working as an agent on that. And
helping nab the
RCMP.
bikers.
Yeah.
So the national fallout from this, though, is that we've got this, the Trudeau government used this within weeks to announce on May 1st, I mean, it wasn't even 2 full weeks, May 1st, 2020, they announced a massive gun ban, and then the so-called buyback program that 5 years later, they haven't bought back. I mean, they never owned the guns, but they haven't seized a single firearm from any licensed law-abiding gun owners. This is all happening because of what you say is an RCMP cover-up of an undercover agent behaving badly and the RCMP botching all of it. And we're going to end up with this huge cost for seizing guns from legal, licensed, law-abiding gun owners. It's utterly bizarre.
Well, what I'm showing and what I'd hope to show in a future book is that how I knew this was going to be a cover-up was based on me looking at cover-ups in the past, coming at them after the fact, recognizing them, seeing how they worked, and then having the media calling me a conspiracy theorist. So I looked at the playbook they used to implement social policy, social engineering, get what they wanted, for the government to get what they wanted, or big business to get what they wanted. And I looked at that playbook and I was prepared for this one. And I knew they were going to use the same playbook with a few twists, which they did. And so I covered it in real time. So I knew what I was looking for. You know, if you look back over, I don't know if you can see it over my left shoulder, you can't see it, but I got a whole stack of the Mass Casualty Commission report. Like, it's this high, all these different volumes. The real story was in the last volume, halfway through, that nobody read. And that was that in spite of everyone saying it was going to be transparent and we're all working together, the commission said the federal government, DOJ, and the RCMP stymied them at many turns, refused to give them documents, refused to cooperate, and basically caused them not to be able to do the most transparent job they were hoping to do. So
sounds like the Foreign Interference Commission.
That's how it all works, Brian. That's the point. This is not just about the shootings in Nova Scotia. This is how the world works in Canada. This is how it's long worked. The Braidwood Commission, the Arar Inquiry. I get into the Arar Inquiry and show how that taught me to look at this. So it's the story of Canada and how it really works, brought down to, look, I dissect it at the base level, but it can apply to almost every issue over the last 40 years. This is their playbook.
Paul, it's a fascinating read and a fascinating story. I encourage everyone to go out and pick it up, local bookstores or online, however you want to get it. Thanks so much for the time.
Well, thank you very much.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue, theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libman is the executive producer. Please subscribe to Full Comment wherever you get your podcast, on Amazon, Apple, Spotify, wherever it is. Help us out by giving us a rating and leaving a review, and share this with your friends and family, email, social media, however you do it. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I Promised You. 2 years later, he was still opposition leader, and he lost again to the Pearson Liberals. Despite this, Diefenbaker doesn't resign as leader of the Progressive Conservatives, which put the party in an awkward situation that hasn't really happened before. The typical rules of a Canadian political party were that you stayed leader until you died or resigned. And if you lost twice in a row, you were supposed to do the honorable thing and step aside. But Diefenbaker just didn't, prompting the party to take the unprecedented step of forcing a party convention in Toronto for the singular purpose of crowbarring Diefenbaker out of the leadership. Diefenbaker shows up, pretends everything is fine, and gives a finger-wagging speech chastising his fellow party members for their disloyalty.
I followed this party when I didn't agree with policies. I gave loyalty to leader after leader, because I believe that there is no other way.
He's politely cheered by the assembled Conservatives and then abjectly humiliated in their subsequent leadership vote. On the first ballot, Diefenbaker gets a distant 5th place, and even then he refuses to admit defeat. If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get your podcasts.